Hello, my name is Ruth Morgan-Thomas and I'm the Global Coordinator of NSWP. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to HIV 2020 Online Opening Plenary. HIV 2020 online sessions offer a safe and neutral space for sharing of knowledge, experience, skills and opinions in a mutually respectful manner. HIV 2020 Online operates a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of bullying, harassment, abusive use of language, aggressive expression of opinions, or any such undesirable behaviours. This includes any activities during the Zoom sessions or on HIV 2020 online social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, that may cause distress to panelists, speakers, interpreters, and/or participants. Session participants who engage in such actions will be immediately removed from the session with no prior notice. So this is our zero tolerance policy that will operate throughout the entire HIV 2020 online. This HIV 2020 online session is being recorded and will be live streamed on the HIV 2020 online Facebook page. After this session, the recording will be made available on the HIV 2020 online website and our social media platforms in the translated languages. All HIV 2020 online sessions are offered in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Russian. Please click on the interpretation button on the lower part of your screen to access interpretation. If you do not hear your interpreter clearly, then click on the mute original audio in the interpretation menu. For panelists and speakers, please speak slowly and clearly in order for the interpreters to be able to translate clearly. For attendees, please note that you do not have the microphone or video functions enabled. Attendees may ask you questions or provide comments by raising hands through the raise hand button. Your microphone will only be unmuted if you are identified to speak by the moderator. Please use the Q&A option to raise questions to the panelists or the chat option for comments. Please note, as we said before, nuisance behaviours will not be tolerated and you may be removed permanently from all HIV 2020 online sessions without notice. Please note that depending on the volume of attendees and questions, all those who raise hands may not be able to speak, and all questions in the Q&A box may not be answered. We thank you again for your participation and hope that you will have a successful session with us today. So now I wish to formally, maybe not yet, welcome you to this online session. So, as I said before, my name is Ruth Morgan-Thomas and I am Global Coordinator of NSWP. I do wish to welcome you to HIV 2020 Online. As a sex worker, I've had a long and at times a difficult relationship with the international AIDS conferences. Too often the IS has failed to give serious consideration to the meaningful involvement of communities most impacted by HIV. In 1990, the IAC was held in San Francisco at a time when the US had legal travel restrictions against people living with HIV. And while there was a commitment that future conferences would not be held in countries that prohibited the entry of people living with HIV, there was no such commitment for communities most affected by HIV, key populations, many of whom are living with HIV. In 1994, the IEC was organized in Yokohama, in a country that prohibits in law the entry of sex workers, along, by the way, with murderers and drug traffickers. While the Japanese government granted me a visa to enter the country, as I was a member of the conference organizing committee, and I understand that I was the first sex worker to enter Japan legally, my colleagues had to enter illegally to attend the conference. I took a 16-year break after Yokohama as I'd become disillusioned with the way conferences were being run and the lack of meaningful engagement with my community. But returning in 2010 in my role as NSWP Global Coordinator, I was stunned to discover that the IAS had chosen Washington as the location for the 2012 conference. While I celebrated the US lifting travel restrictions for people living with HIV, sex workers and people who use drugs, including those living with HIV, were still prohibited from entering the US. Did we not count? All assurances that our communities would be able to safely enter the US came to nothing. And so NSWP organized an alternative event in Calcutta, known as the Sex Worker Freedom Festival, by and for sex workers. It was both a celebration and a protest that held up the light of our community's expertise, knowledge, and lived experiences that are so crucial to the HIV response. We amplified the voice of those excluded. And yet, in 2020, here we are again. But this time, we are united with GMP+, INPUD, and MPact, and activists from across the world who share our belief that it is time for change. We are challenging the powers that be that have failed to listen to our voices, to enter into a meaningful conversation with us, to embrace dissent and challenge, to open their eyes and minds to the opportunities that exist if they are willing to share and shift power. HIV 2020 is a protest. We are challenging business as usual. We are inviting those in power to reflect on the potential of truly partnering with our communities. But HIV 2020 is also a celebration of our communities reclaiming the response. We hope many of you will join us over the next 4 months in both protesting and celebrating our communities. I hand you over now to George Ayala at MPact.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I appreciate it. I can't start my video, guys. Let me just try to do that. There we go.
Yep. No
Hi,
problem.
everyone. Welcome. I'm going to add my warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. HIV 2020 is indeed a protest. It's a protest against patronizing condescension, against top-down decision makers who exclude us, who talk at us and not with us. It is an example of what is possible when we untether ourselves from business as usual to reclaim space and reclaim discourse. HIV 2020 is an important show of solidarity between people living with HIV, gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and transgender people, intersecting communities hardest hit by HIV. At HIV 2020, community members and community advocates are welcomed, encouraged to contribute, and treated as the experts that we are, with deep knowledge to share. After all, our bodies are subjected to state-sanctioned and socially supported violence on a daily basis. We live with and are most affected by HIV. We are therefore best positioned to author and to lead responses to HIV. Our experiences and the collectivist strategies we employ to thrive make us the experts over our own lives. HIV 2020 is an example of community-led solution sharing that builds on itself and that can more effectively and more swiftly address the holistic health needs of our communities. And HIV 2020 is proof of concept that when communities are in the lead and working together, anything is possible. Within the first 24 hours that we announced an alternative event, there were 3,000 people registered to attend. And today we have over 1,000 registrants for the opening plenary, which will take place over the next several months through October. So please stay engaged, stay informed, stay connected, stay unified, and stay vocal, and have a great conference. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll unmute. Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Chang, the Executive Director of the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. Welcome to the first community-led HIV conference, a co-created global platform for communities to showcase our own ideas, solutions, and strategies. HIV 2020 is a protest against top-down decision-making. To this end, community advocates and experts worldwide have come together and rallied behind 10 recommendations to the International AIDS Society, demanding more meaningful, respectful, and equitable engagement. Our recommendations for change are to 1, limit the size of the conference to no more than 7,500, so that more countries from the global south can competitively bid to host. 2, disqualify countries with poor human rights records and travel restrictions for people living with HIV, gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, transgender people, and Muslims from hosting the conference. 3, we demand that the IES review the frequency in which the conference occurs in consultation with communities. The timing should be determined by important scientific and policy developments, as well as advocacy opportunities. 4, the conference should be linked to collaboratively developed and community-endorsed advocacy priorities. 5, we want the conference to focus on new high-impact scientific findings, community-led research, novel community-authored approaches, and urgent political issues that affect us, such as criminalization. 6, make the conference more participatory and interdisciplinary by including other fields related to HIV, and by introducing more equity between basic, clinical, implementation, community, and social research. 7, ensure equal numbers of researchers, public health professionals, funders, community advocates, and experts on the conference coordinating committee. 8, to eliminate permanent member status on the CCC in favor of a predetermined number of rotating seats. The seats designated for advocates must reflect communities most impacted by HIV. 9, to create a standing community-based participatory action research track that is peer-reviewed by community researchers and advocates. And finally, 10, to improve the meaningful engagement of communities living with and most affected by HIV in the development, implementation, and evaluation of future conferences by adding community advocates and experts into the IES Governing Council and waiving membership fees for community experts. HIV 2020 marks a turning point. It's a manifestation of what communities can achieve when we pull together in solidarity to challenge business as usual. Let's harness this opportunity to agitate for wider structural reform. The work doesn't stop with HIV 2020, but is a signpost of what the HIV response could be in the future. I wish you all an inspiring and transformative conference. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rico Gustav. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Network of People with HIV. Nothing to add to the last three speakers, but just to add a warm welcome to everybody. It's very encouraging to see the number of participants that registered for this particular session. And you know, it's also live stream on Facebook, and there has been some comments there as well. So it's very, very encouraging, and it's very uniting us as communities and key populations as well. GNP Plus is very proud of being part of the HIV 2020 co-organizers, in particular because we're protesting against the consistent ignorance from the International AIDS Society, against the diverse voices of communities, particularly diverse voices of key populations in the global AIDS response. So I hope that you're as excited as I am to joining these important events and basically kick some asses. So please feel free to discuss and connect with each other, and also please forward the event, the messages of the event to your network as well. I don't think that you're here to actually hear us talking, so let's just get started. But before that, again, welcome to everybody, and let's start. So in this next session, we're just going to hear from a couple of people that has been occupying important spaces in the global, regional, and national AIDS response. We're first going to hear from Winnie Byanyima, and Winnie is the Executive Director of the UNAIDS. She's a feminist and global leader on social justice issues. She also started in UNAIDS in 1st of November 2019, and prior to that, she served for 6 years as the Executive Director of the Oxfam International. As a Member of Parliament, she led Uganda's first Parliamentary Women Caucus, championing groundbreaking gender equality provisions in the country's 1995 post-conflict constitution. She has also served at the African Union Commission and as Director of Gender and Development at the UNDP. She founded the civil society organization Forum for Women in Democracy and co-founded the 60-member Global Gender and Climate Alliance of Civil Society, bilateral and multilateral organizations. She has served on numerous global boards and commissions, including the African Capacity Building Foundation and the International Center for Research on Women. Winnie provided a video of her interview, and we asked her one particular question, sort of broad questions, which is like, in your view, in Winnie's view, why are communities central to the global HIV response? Because we keep on saying this, but maybe let's hear from Winnie. Why does she think the communities are central? Can we start the video? Are we starting the video? Yeah, it seems like people are struggling to start the video. Yeah, some participants have been mentioning that there's no signal. We are trying to connect. Yeah, there you go. Yes, Marking mentioned there will be glitches, everyone. So trust me, there will be. And then let's start the video.
Friends. My name is Winnie Byanyima. I lead the UN's global response to AIDS. I'm delighted to join you today for the opening session of HIV 2020. I want to start by paying tribute to the courage and leadership of communities from the very earliest days of AIDS to the present day. Let me start by telling you about Juliana Atieno, a young woman I met in Nairobi who inspired me. You can see her and her beautiful boys in the photo. Juliana volunteers in her local health facility as a mentor mother and supports pregnant women who test HIV positive. Juliana was herself diagnosed with HIV as a teenager, and she was already very ill. Today, she's healthy and the mother of those two lovely boys. She spoke to me passionately and with great expertise about her work. Like so many leaders in the HIV response, Juliana has overcome discrimination and violence to become a critical link for her whole community with the local health facility. She is the first person to accompany people for testing, supporting them, following them through the complex health system. Juliana is an AIDS counselor and a community mobilizer. For this critical role, Juliana receives a small stipend of $20 a month. That's not just. Juliana is one of thousands of volunteers making up the HIV social capital, our unique and extensive HIV infrastructure, which fosters resilience in communities and strengthens health systems around the world. From the early days in New York and San Francisco, in Johannesburg and Kampala, in Bangkok and Mumbai, it is activists in their communities who have led. People living with HIV, women, gay men, sex workers, transgender people, people who use drugs. They organize their communities and claim their rights. This courageous community activism led to some of the most important breakthroughs in the HIV response. Initially, these groups focused on prevention, leading powerful behavior change and testing campaigns, and speaking out on youth empowerment and living positively with HIV. And they fought tooth and nail for treatments to be developed, with some of the most creative civil disobedience campaigns this world has ever seen. When treatment became available, treatment access campaigns led by communities catalyzed treatment expansion around the world. And peer-led treatment literacy campaigns kept people on their life-saving drugs. And now we have service delivery for prevention, for testing, for treatment, led by and for communities. Thanks to local and global activists organized in networks, such as the Treatment Action Campaign of South Africa and ACT UP, life-saving medications were developed more quickly and prices brought down. Innovation and science were made available to all people. Today, we have 25.4 million people on HIV treatment. But our journey is not finished. 12.6 million people continue to wait, and every year, more people acquire HIV. 1.7 million new infections in 2019. We must fight on with passion, and we must keep human rights at the center of our societies and of our health systems, or we will not end the HIV epidemic. For millions of people, it is human rights violations, stigma, discrimination, and criminalization that stand in the way to their right to health. In the last 6 months, COVID-19 has devastated our world. It's taken lives, destroyed livelihoods, and crushed economies. In developing countries with a high burden of HIV, governments are struggling to respond to two colliding epidemics, HIV and COVID. Where we see successful COVID responses, Governments are leveraging the HIV infrastructure and networks that so many of you have contributed to. We should be proud of that. From Cambodia to South Africa, to Kazakhstan, to Mexico, HIV activists, health volunteers, and communities have mobilized to help the people around them to survive the coronavirus. They are finding the people who need to test. They are connecting them with testing. They are doing the contact tracing and following up with them for treatment and care. Once again, we see communities showing their value, their courage, their leadership, and their resilience. So to build back better from COVID, we must strengthen prevention and epidemic preparedness. And what we've learned from HIV is that this comes from empowered communities. Resilient health systems of the future must invest adequately in communities, in Juliana and the thousands of activists like her. This is how we will beat HIV and COVID-19 and be prepared for the next health crisis. We need you, just like the motto of your conference says, to reclaim the global response. I wish everyone a very successful and productive conference. Thank you.
And that was Winnie, a very powerful statement from the Executive Director of the UNAIDS. And from the global level, let's move to the national level leaders, which is Dr. Alethse de la Torre Rosas. Dr. Alethse is the General Director of CENSIDEA, based in Ministry of Health in Mexico. She's leading the national HIV response and hepatitis C program since July 2019. She's also the infectious disease and internal medicine specialist with Master of Science in Public Health in developing countries. She's recognized as a champion in Mexico of the WHO's Patient for Patient Safety, or PFPS network. She's an experienced lecturer in infectious disease, epidemiology, and medical statistics. Over the last 10 years, over 10 years of clinical and academic research experience focusing on infectious and emerging disease, developing programs to improve the quality of safety and of patient care, healthcare evaluation, patient-reported outcomes, and outcomes metrics in healthcare. Now, the question that we posed to Dr. Alethse in her video interview was, what strategies would you suggest for changing the tide and rallying support behind HIV response, led by gay, bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex worker, and transgender people? Let's watch the video.
Hello, my name is Alethse de la Torre Rosas, and I'm the General Director of the National Center for the Prevention and Control of HIV/AIDS, CENSIDEA, at the Ministry of Health, Mexico. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for their invitation and the opportunity to share with you our perspective at this important forum. It is an honor to be here with you today. When we think about the strategies for rallying support behind HIV responses, in particular strategies that are led by gay or bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and transgender people, we necessarily need to discuss why this is important for the HIV global response. Around the world, healthcare systems are struggling with rising costs and uneven quality. Healthcare leaders and policymakers have tried different strategies, such as enforcing practice guidelines, reducing errors, attacking fraud, amongst others with limited impact. We are far from reaching our goal of ending the HIV epidemic. Gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and transgender people are among the remaining groups for whom HIV is uncontrolled across the world. For instance, men who have sex with men are more likely to be living with HIV compared with people in the general population in low and middle income countries. And transgender people have lower survival rates than other groups. In addition, criminalization, discrimination, and sexual stigma that the LGBT community, as well as people who use drugs and sex workers face on a daily basis, limits the provision and uptake of HIV prevention, treatment, and care service, which leads to worse outcomes, therefore increasing inequalities. The inability to deliver programs that are tailored to the needs of these communities threatens to reach global, regional, and national HIV targets. Trusting healthcare systems is based on the assumption that the person's best interests are being considered during the decision-making process. However, although people and community-centered care is becoming a widely used concept in medical settings, it is poorly understood and often neglected. People-centered care implies that the patient's values, needs, and preferences should help guide the clinical decisions and programs. To meet the UNAIDS targets to end the AIDS epidemic, we need to deliver programs that are acceptable to communities. It is time to stop doing everything for communities without actually including them. People living with HIV and the key populations are the only ones who can genuinely identify from their own personal perspective which health outcomes are essential for them and evaluate if these are being achieved by the programs installed. After all, they are the ones experiencing the barriers, challenges, the health outcomes and their impact in every aspect of their lives, 24/7. Exclusion of gay and bisexual men, transgender people, people who use drugs and sex workers from participating in national AIDS planning programs and HIV community-led responses can result in national plans that omit or neglect their needs, which in turn contributes to the lack of funding and inaccessible or poorly targeted programs. The inclusion of communities and increasing peer support can potentially help to increase adherence, retention in care, virologic suppression, and therefore to reduce the transmission, strengthening the HIV treatment cascade. On the other hand, not taking into consideration people's needs can lead to barriers to receiving their treatment and loss of follow-up. From the government's perspective, we need timely and reliable information to maximize the efficiency of our intervention. There is no way of achieving value for healthcare other than having communities' voice at the center. And this is another area where the communities that are most affected need to not be left behind. Community-led responses can help national programs and health institutions to identify persistent problems, barriers, and solutions that are adequate by helping to monitor their outcomes. Community-led responses can reach geographical regions and people that the majority of healthcare systems have no access to. There's huge room for improvement in defining value and co-creating meaningful metrics and registries from a broad, plural perspective involving people and communities, in particular for those who have not yet been reached or for whom their policies are not working. Investing in HIV responses that are led by the most affected communities, gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and transgender people, can help to generate programs that bring value for all, and this can be measured, such as appropriate care in order to achieve people's personal goals, achievement of best possible outcomes with available resources, which is the technical value for healthcare systems, fair resource distribution across all patient groups, and contribution of healthcare to social participation. By involving community partnerships, it is feasible to create mechanisms to facilitate key populations' feedback on services and programs. They help to create social networks for those already marginalized to improve accountability and responsiveness and implement comprehensive and quality HIV services. Community involvement can be of great value, allowing for optimization of local resources. By sharing data and insights, providers, governments, and communities can learn from each other, motivate participants, and facilitate changes for the implementation of policies. Why would we support HIV responses that are led by gay, bisexual men, transgender people, people who use drugs and sex workers? First of all, because it's the correct thing to do. No one should be left behind. And secondly, because it's a strategy in a world with limited resources that will help to transform healthcare systems and make them more efficient and reduce inequalities. We can maximize our results by investing in the groups where the epidemic is not controlled and focusing on partnerships that bring the prevention strategies and healthcare to where it's needed, alongside programs that are acceptable and adequate to these communities. In doing so, we will achieve our goal of offering true value to all peoples and communities. Thank you.
And thanks for Dr. Alethse. Dr. Alethse has joined us in the audience as well. Hi, Doctor. If you can, please say hi to everyone as well. Thank you very much for that another powerful statement as well. And people, please feel free to comment and discuss in the chat box or in the Facebook as well. I'm monitoring the Facebook. After this, we're going to have a discussion with the community panelists where some of the questions in the chat and in the Facebook stream, I will take it and feature it in the session as well. So I'm monitoring the Facebook as well. The next speaker is Peter Sands, who's the head of the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria. Peter has been in that position, the executive director of the Global Fund, since March 2018. Since June 2015, Peter has been a research fellow in Harvard University, dividing his time between Mozaffar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Global Health Institute. He was also the group CEO of Standard Chartered PLC from November 2006 to June 2015, having joined the board of Standard Chartered Group as Group CFO in May 2002. Peter also graduated from Oxford University with a first-class degree in politics, philosophy, and economics. He also received a master in public administration from Harvard University, where he was a Harkness Fellow. Peter, who grew up in Singapore and Malaysia, is married to author and bookshop owner Betsy Tobin and has 4 children. So Peter, we asked Peter to provide us with video interview, and one of the questions that we asked was, how will COVID-19 pandemic influence investment in community and key population-led HIV response, especially given current political push to focus on global pandemic preparedness and health security? What does that mean for gay and bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex worker and transgender people, groups which continue to shoulder HIV disease burden, and for which HIV incidence is still not well managed? So let's start watching the video.
COVID-19 is a massive challenge for all of us engaged in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Not only are people living with HIV who are immunocompromised likely to be more vulnerable to COVID-19, not only are HIV prevention and treatment programs suffering significant disruption with frightening consequences for those on ART or those most vulnerable to infection. Not only are financial resources, medical staff and equipment, and political attention and visibility being diverted from the fight against HIV to combat the new virus. Not only are many of those amongst key populations especially vulnerable to the economic consequence of the pandemic itself and of lockdowns, but also in many places, the somewhat technocratic, top-down public health measures being taken, threatening either inadvertently or actually being exploited to recreate human rights related barriers to access and to fuel stigma and discrimination. After many years of progress in the fight against HIV and AIDS, and in promoting a more rights-based, people-centered vision of health, we face the prospect of going backwards. You'll all have seen the UNAIDS WHO analysis that suggests that interruptions to ART could see an additional 534,000 deaths over the next 12 months. That would take us back to the annual death toll we saw in 2008, 12 years ago. It's staggering to think that we could lose so much, so fast. That many lives, all that effort, all those billions of dollars that got us this far. We cannot let this happen. That should be our red line. We cannot go backwards. In the fight against HIV and AIDS, every one of our gains are so hard won, and we cannot surrender them. We owe it to those who have died, to those who are infected, to those who are vulnerable, to prevent this happening and to continue our progress towards ending the epidemic. So, what should we do? First of all, we must act quickly to adapt HIV prevention and treatment programs to the new reality. The disruption on the ground is real. Results from our latest survey of over 100 countries in which we invest suggest 85% of our HIV programs are suffering some level of disruption, with about 15% reporting high or very high levels. On the other hand, we're seeing national AIDS programs and civil society organizations across the world innovating and changing with courage and creativity, shifting to multi-month dispensing and home delivery of ARTs, providing nutritional support and other forms of support to the most vulnerable, moving prevention activities online, accelerating the rollout of community-based and self-testing. We need to ensure these initiatives are supported, scaled up, sustained, that good ideas are disseminated quickly. Second, the HIV community should lean into the response to the COVID-19 crisis. Much of this response is actually based on the capabilities and infrastructure put in place to fight HIV anyway, whether it's viral load testing instruments being used for COVID-19 diagnosis, or HIV community outreach organizations supporting communications and contact tracing. We should ensure that all we have learned about how to fight one pandemic is used to fight this one. The imperative to let and empower communities to lead. The imperative of equitable access to medical tools. The imperative to reach out to the poorest and most marginalized. That's how we ensure the COVID-19 response becomes more people-centered, more rights-based, and more effective. That's how we ensure that in the fight against COVID-19, as in the fight against HIV, we leave no one behind. And make no mistake, we need the response to COVID-19 to be effective. Otherwise, it is the same people, those who are the most vulnerable to HIV, who will again be the ones who suffer most. Third, we need to ensure that the COVID-19 response strategies take full account of the knock-on impact of diseases such as HIV. That the measure of success is not just minimizing the deaths from COVID-19, but the total deaths caused by the pandemic, including the knock-on impact on HIV, TB, and malaria. In some of the countries in which the Global Fund invests, this knock-on impact could be as much as or exceed the direct impact. If the goal is simply to be minimizing COVID-19 deaths, we will see huge diversion of resources. If the goal is minimizing the total impact, we'll still see some diversion, but at least we can be thoughtful about how to manage the trade-offs and interdependencies. Fourth, we need to act to protect those in the front line. And I don't just mean salaried doctors and nurses. I mean all those providing vital services, including community health workers engaged with key populations. This means providing training and high quality personal protective equipment, PPE. And finally, we must act to fix the most glaring weaknesses in systems of health. What these are differs from country to country, but laboratories in most countries are struggling to cope, and it's viral load testing and TB diagnosis that is getting squeezed out. Community-led systems are being encouraged and nurtured in some places, but ignored or resisted in others, and that won't work. If there's one lesson we've learned from the fight against HIV and AIDS, it's that you need community leadership. And that will hold true with COVID-19 as well. The Global Fund has moved swiftly to support countries in responding to COVID-19. At the beginning of March, we introduced grant flexibilities, allowing countries to use grant savings and to reprogram up to 5% of their allocation to adapt their HIV, TB, and malaria programs, to support their COVID-19 response, and to make urgent fixes to their health systems. That made up to $500 million available. In April, we went further, introducing the COVID-19 response mechanism, or C19RM, making another $500 million available. So far, 96 countries and 8 regional programs have accessed these mechanisms, investing over $369 million. To give you some examples of the actions that have been taken, in Kenya, BHESP, one of the oldest organizations providing support to sex workers, has been providing ARTs, condoms, hygiene kits to sex workers and supporting them. In Zimbabwe, Roots Africa has been providing nutritional support to the most vulnerable women and girls. In Ukraine, 100% Life is providing ARTs by courier to people living with HIV so as to minimize their exposure. In Uganda, there's been extra support provided to sustain prevention of mother-to-child transmission interventions and to adapt differentiated service delivery models. Across a number of countries, we have supported increases in HIV self-testing, increased supply of antiretrovirals to enable multi-month dispensing, and also a range of innovations to enable outreach, health education, training, and consultations to be done digitally. But this is only the beginning. If we are to prevent COVID-19 overwhelming health systems in the most vulnerable countries in the world, and the potentially devastating impact that could result in on HIV, TB, and malaria, as well as on maternal health and immunization programs. We need a different scale of response. The Global Fund recently published a report on mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on countries affected by HIV, TB, and malaria. In this report, we estimated that countries need an incremental $28.5 billion over the next 12 months to do four things: adapt the HIV, TB, and malaria programs to avoid them being derailed, to protect vital frontline health workers with PPE, personal protective equipment, and training, including community health workers, to make urgent fixes to health systems, including laboratory networks, supply chains, and strengthening community-led systems for health, and to enable countries to access the tools they need to fight COVID-19 even before vaccines or therapeutics become available, most obviously by helping them massively scaling up testing, tracing, and isolation. The Global Fund is committed to playing our role in this response. As the institution created to fight the last pandemic affecting humanity, we bring a unique combination of capabilities to the fight, not least our understanding of the imperative of engaging and empowering communities. Moreover, no other institution is as well placed to manage the complex interdependencies between the response to COVID-19 and the knock-on consequences on the other diseases. We must leverage the infrastructure and capabilities put in place to fight HIV, TB, and malaria. But we must also not lose sight of the risks to these diseases as well. So when we use Abbott and Roche molecular diagnostic instruments that we have funded for HIV viral load testing, or gene expert instruments that we funded for TB diagnosis for COVID-19 testing, we mustn't forget the imperative of continuing the viral load and TB testing. Saving people from COVID-19 only to have them die of HIV and AIDS or TB isn't success, or vice versa. So we must look at this not just as a fight against any one particular virus, be it COVID-19 or HIV, but as a fight against the infectious diseases that most affect and threaten the poorest and most marginalized. We must fight this new fight, and we must finish the unfinished fights against HIV, TB, and malaria. And we must get better prepared to fight pathogens as yet unseen. Above all, in the fight against HIV and in the fight against COVID-19, we must leave no one behind. Actually, my nightmare is a scenario where the rich parts of the world succeed in controlling and containing COVID-19, effectively eliminating it as a public health threat. But the virus still persists and still kills large numbers of people in the poorest countries and among marginalized communities. In other words, the fight against COVID-19 follows a path not dissimilar as what has happened with the earlier, still unfinished fights against HIV and TB, becoming in a sense a residual pandemic, no longer thought of as a global health security issue, a fight where we have, to put it bluntly, we have left people behind. But there's also a much better scenario, where this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, becomes the catalyst to reframe and re-energize the fight against HIV, where the whole idea of residual pandemics becomes unacceptable, where we truly commit to leaving no one behind, whether to HIV, COVID-19, TB, or malaria. To get to this place, we have to demonstrate that this is all one and the same fight. That the battle against infectious disease is not just a battle against any one particular virus, but a commitment to make everyone safe. That it's about finishing the fights that we haven't yet won against HIV, TB, and malaria. That it's about winning the new fight against COVID-19. To get here, the HIV community needs to step up, to grapple with a new reality, to act. This is the community that will make the world's response to COVID-19 people-centered and rights-based. This is the community that will make the response a total response, not just narrowly focused on those testing positive to COVID-19. We need to show leadership. We need to unite to fight.
Another alarm sounded by Peter Sands on COVID-19 and HIV and the impact to key populations and communities. I see that there's quite a lot of conversations happening in the Facebook and in our chat. Please continue to do so. Please tell us what you think about what Peter talked about on the knock-on impact of the COVID-19 to HIV. But more importantly, share your personal experience on COVID-19 and how it interacts with your identity as key populations or as someone who's living with HIV. Either your personal experience or share what you observe happening with your community related to that. So our last video conversation, video interview from this particular series came from the Netherlands, country where I'm based in. It's from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Netherlands, Minister Sigrid Kaag. Sorry, Sigrid Kaag, who has been lost my notes. So Sigrid Kaag is a Minister of the Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation. Previously, she served, among other positions, Under Secretary General in Lebanon, with responsibilities for all UN activities in the country. As UN Under Secretary General leading the mission to eliminate chemical weapons in Syria, as Assistant Secretary General for UNDP in New York, and as UNICEF's Regional Director for Middle East and North Africa in Amman. Ms. Kaag holds an MA in the Middle East Studies, University of Exeter, another degree on international relations from Oxford University, and a BA in Middle East Studies as well. I interviewed her in this video, and one of the questions that we asked her is, what commitments can you make for ensuring that communities of gay, bisexual men, people who use drugs, sex workers, transgender people, and people living with HIV stay at the center of the global HIV response? Let's listen to Minister Kaag's response to that.
Hi, Minister Kaag. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.
One of the first questions that we would like to ask is, what are the commitments that has been made by Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make sure that gay, bisexual men, sex workers, transgender, and people with HIV stay at the center of the global HIV response?
Well, thank you very much. I think the Netherlands has been a long-standing partner over the years of all alliances, activists, communities affected by HIV/AIDS. And of course, we strive to have the right policies, but also programs in place that reach the people most in need and most vulnerable. So one of them, of course, is investments in global partnerships such as the Global Fund, UNAIDS, but of course community-led responses are equally important because they have the biggest reach. And we do that twofold. One of them is at the policy and the political level to strive for access to universal health coverage, particularly for those most marginalized, sometimes within their own countries, as it comes to issues that are derived also from living with HIV/AIDS, such as being marginalized on the labor market, access to social support. Secondly, of course, is access to medicine. well, that's maybe the first one, but also the second layer. And we want to finance that, and we want to make sure that the largest number of people are reached consistently, but in a rights-based manner. So the rights-based lens is used in all the decisions that we make. And it's very important that we build really the alliances, such as the Love Alliance. There are many other examples that are very effective, working at community level, led by activists and people living with HIV/AIDS, and they're the best to know what's required, and they know their own communities, and ultimately will have the best results for them. It's their choice, their lives, and they need to live their lives in the way they want to live their lives.
The Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite unique in terms of its approach with and supporting community-led response, and we usually call it the Dutch approach as well. So how do you collaborate with and strategically align approaches with other governments in their efforts towards the investing in the HIV/AIDS response?
Yeah, we do it in many different ways. Of course, at the level of governance of the different international organizations, such as UNAIDS, but other organizations too that have efficient and effective programs on sexual rights, reproductive health, including support, political and policy support, and health care for people living with HIV/AIDS. But there's also a prevention agenda. And I think you need to always combine these two. So we build alliances. We are a clear, I think, and loud voice within the alliances externally. And we will not, in that sense, yield to the pressures of conservative voices that are rearing their heads again also these days. And secondly, of course, we like to invest in innovative approaches. And I think community-led pioneering can be very helpful, especially when you need to deal also with issues of discrimination, marginalization, and status issues for those people living with HIV/AIDS. A lot of it, I think, is the sort of the art of politics, but making sure that people that need to be reached benefit ultimately. So the Dutch approach is, I think, a pragmatic one, but also a principled one.
And in addition to its partnership with and investment in civil society, what are other ways the ministry invests in and ensures that communities of sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people, and people who use drugs and people living with HIV stay at the center of the global HIV response? And also, please feel free to say your last message for us.
Well, I think it's in everything we do. So in all our programs and our policies, we always take particular population groups into account. And of course, the citizens, individuals, human beings, men having sex with men, sex workers, the LGBTQI community as a whole is a policy priority for us in everything we do, in our foreign policy, but also in our development cooperation. So if you act and prioritize through that lens, you are trying to make sure that no one is left behind and that additional attention is provided for those communities. And that's also important when you look at migrant settings and refugee settings, because in all situations of vulnerability, people that carry sort of an extra layer of vulnerability, be it socially or culturally or within their community, we need to look out for them even more.
So thank you very much, Minister, for that response. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to a wonderful conference.
Thank you.
So, people, that's Minister Kaag, very bold in her statement against the will that has been getting more conservative each day. You know, taking a step and taking a side and declaring that is something that we need to appreciate, especially as government officials as well. So that was the end of the video interviews, and now we're going to go into our community panelists, who's going to comment on some of the things that the previous video interviews has said. I'm going to introduce a couple of panelists. We have 5 panelists for today. I want to check if Phelister is already on the line. Phelister, would you be able to turn on your video so that we can see you? No?
Hi, yes, I am online.
Ah, yeah, Phelister is online. So let me introduce the community panelists, and then after that, we'll go directly into the discussion. Please, again, feel free to put your opinions or your questions in the chat. And also those who are watching from the Facebook, please feel free to do the same as well. I'm monitoring the Facebook, and we'll take some of your comments and questions and put it in the session as well. Phelister Abdallah is the National Coordinator of Kenya Sex Worker Alliance. She is a co-founder of the African Sex Worker Alliance, or ASWA, and one of the pioneers of sex workers movement in Africa. Before joining KESWA, Phelister worked for ICRH Kenya as peer educator and zone leader leading in the organization's advocacy and peer mobilization. Phelister is on the front line, creating awareness and advocating for the rights of sex workers at national, regional, and global levels, including lobbying and advocacy for policy reform and leading in decriminalization of sex work process in Kenya. She's known for her articulation in addressing critical issues such as stigma and discrimination, violence faced by sex workers, community of sex workers empowerment, and inclusion of the sex worker agenda across the country and across Africa. Her dedication to highlighting the issues of sex worker placed her as a strategic key populations, and particularly sex workers board member in the global network of sex work projects, global networks of people with HIV, and at the Global Fund acting as a regional expert on global fund issues. Phelister also serves as on numerous committees and other boards representing sex workers and key populations in Kenya, Africa, and globally. And here we're seeing all of our panelists. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to introduce everyone, and then after that, we'll go into the discussions. Now we go into Jeffrey. Jeffrey is currently the board member of GNT Plus, based in Thailand. He is a Filipino living with HIV and has been advocating for the rights of people living with HIV and HIV key populations since 2006. He is also program officer in APCASO and has extensive experience in health policy advocacy, community development, and research. He holds a bachelor degree in behavioral science from the University of Philippines. Jeff, wave to the audience. That's Jeff. And next is Mahri Bahati. Mahri is a creative and passionate public health professional with extensive experience across the HIV/AIDS continuum of care, including ARV medication access, HIV prevention and surveillance, harm reduction, and community mobilization. Most recently, she worked for the Global Forum on MSM and HIV as public health advisor, where she developed and managed a global capacity building project to facilitate organizational development and build self-sustainability for trans-led organizations throughout the Global South. Her professional interests include sexual and gender minority health equity, HIV treatment adherence, PrEP access, and the prevention of sexually transmitted infections. Mahri earned her Master of Public Health degree at the University of Kentucky in 2013 with a focus on epidemiology. As an undergrad, she began volunteering with local HIV/AIDS nonprofits, which sparked a professional interest in public health, along with a lifelong interest in volunteering and community organizing. She is currently the Director of Programs in IRGT, a global network of trans women and HIV. Mahri, say hi to everyone.
Hello.
Hi. The next speaker is Olga Balyaeva. Olga, say hi to everyone first. Olga is a narco-feminist and drug policy reformer activist from Ukraine. She has pioneered in organizing a community-based needle exchange program in a city that I cannot pronounce. I will put it in the chat later, that city, in 2001. Her educational background is in medical psychology and grant management. Furthermore, she has undertaken community needs assessment, generating evidence-based information, and organized a low-threshold service point for people who use drugs or filters. In 2010, she co-founded an opioid substitution therapy patients association in Ukraine, working to increase the quality of oral substitution therapy. Between 2013 and 2019, Ola worked at the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, or ERA, as manager of community of people who use drugs, leading on advocacy programs such as From the Street to Government. Since 2017, Ola is serving on the board of directors of Harm Reduction International, or HRI. In February 2020, the community of people who use drugs from Eastern Europe and Central Asia elected Ola as program coordinator of Eurasian network of people living with people who use drugs. Sorry, ENPUD. So
yes.
Ola, say again hi.
Thank you. Thank you.
And the last speaker is Sergio Lopez. Sergio, say hi to everyone.
Hola, hi.
Hi, Sergio. So Sergio is Paraguayan activist and program officer with Somos Gay, a grassroots organization committed to the innovation of effective strategies against homophobia, the fight against HIV, and the promotion and defense of human rights. With over 10 years of experience in social movement, Sergio continues organize actions with young communities in safe spaces and Center for LGBTI+ people, as well as carrying out campaigns with the Gay Latino Network based in Asunción. So welcome again, everyone. So let's start our discussion because we have watched interesting videos, 4 of them, basically. And there's quite a lot of important message there, obviously. And, you know, we heard a lot of ideas and a lot of take in terms of how keep the situation with key populations and people living with HIV and HIV in general. There's also a lot of discussions around COVID as well, which we're going to ask you about. But maybe the first question goes to Phelister. Phelister, if you can see us, yeah, okay, I can see you. You're in the car, obviously, you're going somewhere. So I know that you heard about the video before this as well, and Winnie talked quite a lot about the role of communities and their and key populations and their critical importance in HIV response, TB and malaria. No, sorry, HIV response. But she did not only talk about the role as a service provider, she also talked about the role as advocates and how we can actually push for progress, for accountability as well. But in your own experience, what has been the real challenge of making sure that the key populations is at the center of HIV response? Go ahead, Phelister.
Thank you so much, Rico. Yes, I'm in the car. I would like to put my response in 3 words, as I was told: unity, partnership, and visibility. Most of the time, when we were starting, I would like to respond my question to a little bit of a story. When we were starting as sex workers movement in Kenya, we started the movement because of the frustrations that we were facing, the violence, access to services was a challenge, and we felt like we were not being reached because we kept on losing many of our community members. And it seemed like death was our portion because in a week we could have lost more than 20 sex workers in a span of 1 month due to violence and due to HIV, because the quality of services that was being provided to our community and us was not kind of responding to what we were really facing as a community. I remember one time I went for a government meeting. I was with a friend, his name is John Madenge. Then we entered into the meeting. Then we met Ruth Morgan. Madenge knew him earlier. And we really made a lot of noise because of the frustrations that we have. One is the fact that we did not have the capacity to sit on the table and communicate with the people who were making this decision for us to be able to access the quality services that we want as key population. We were not part of that table, so we had to force ourselves inside. After the meeting, Ruth asked us, "What did you just guys do?" And we said, "No, we told them the truth." And she said, "That's not the way to communicate. I think you people need capacity." And from that time, she started the mentorship with us Africans as the African Sex Workers Alliance. As the person working with the Kenyan Sex Workers Alliance, one of the things that we did is actually identified our problems. And she was like, "How do you respond to this?" I have undergone a lot of trainings personally for me to be able to sensitize my community, making the Kenyan sex workers where it is. I remember there was nobody who could be able to support even the movement. There was nobody who was able to do anything because it was impossible for us because we didn't know the channels. We could not even apply for funding. We couldn't even express our problems to anybody. But I think one of the things that was done is for us to be given that capacity. We came together, we went to India to learn, and later we said we want to start the Sex Workers Academy of Africa so that we can be able to learn from each other, so that we can be able to learn from our African cultures and see how we can be able to respond to our problems. That is how they responded with their capacity building support that they had with NSWP. We've been able to build our own Kenyan movement where people were coming to Kenya, other countries to learn from us. We have sex workers-led organizations in Kenya today being funded, and they are providing services to their fellow sex workers. We have sex workers-led organizations in Kenya who are today running clinics and hiring doctors and nurses and making sure that sex workers who are living with HIV are able to access better treatment in a friendly way because the sex workers are in the center of making that decision. I have seen the presenters have always spoken about leaving nobody behind. Even in these videos, I have had the recording of leaving nobody behind. Yet in the real sense, when people are talking about leaving nobody behind, if the community does not have the capacity, then it is very complicated for them to be able to go to the spaces where people are. If the community cannot communicate genuinely and understand the issues, it is very complicated for community to be able to occupy those spaces. I can come and sit down as a sex worker, contribute nothing and say nothing because my capacity does not allow me, because I do not understand the terminologies that people are using on the table. The lady spoke very well on her video. And she said, we are happy now we are supporting community organizations. KESWA is one of the community organizations that is supported and are bridging the gaps and pitch. And we have done a lot of work. And we have reached a huge number. As she has said, the success of supporting community organization, you reach a huge number of people because we know the problems of the people and we know where to get the people. Today, I want to say that KESWA is a very successful one because of the capacity that was kept in it through NSWP, the African Sex Workers Alliance, then coming to us. We are a member-based organization. Today, while I speak, I want to say 50% of our members are funded directly by the donors. Why? Because we understood the issues, we went through them, and we knew how to respond to them. By people saying leaving nobody behind, let's make sure that the people who are left, we do not want them to be left behind, have enough capacity to be able to respond, can be able to sit on the table and make decisions with other people. It is very sad when we have people making decisions and they think the only thing that can fit us as key population, it is only condoms, it is only HIV, and it is only lubricants. There is more to respond to HIV, more than just condoms and HIV. What I to say is the fact that today KESWA is supported by different funders. Today KESWA has done different things. Even during this COVID response, we are not getting any support from the government. And we have seen how much it has affected our population. One of the things we are making sure is that sex workers living with HIV get their drugs. Sex workers who do not get food and are in need actually have an access to nutrition. And this is supported by friends, donors who trust in community-led initiatives, and friends of sex workers, because we also have a donation link up there to have people supporting the process. One of the things I want to say is the fact that when the community have the capacity and they understand the process, they can do it better. Sex workers are doing it better because we have been given the capacity and an opportunity. I would like to congratulate the support that is coming from global, regional, national, up to the grassroots, because we as the sex workers, we feel like we can engage in the processes because we understand the issues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Phelister. That was awesome. That was a great point that you made. And I know that everybody in the chat is going crazy right now with the Facebook and his chat as well. Again, well, let me tell you what, if you agree with Phelister and what Phelister said, please post on your status, everyone, that I agree with Phelister. Hashtag sex workers do it right. Do it better, sorry. Hashtag sex worker do it better. So thanks a lot, Phelister. That's a great way to start our panel. And of course, I mean, we'll come back to you for another comment later if we have some time. But let me go ahead and go to the next speaker, which is Jeffrey. Hi, Jeff.
Hey.
And I want to ask you about what you think about Peter's comment there, because he mentioned that the COVID-19 can destroy the progress that we have made on not only on HIV, actually, because the Go Fund deals with 3 diseases. It's also on TB and also on malaria as well. And therefore, it needs to be addressed. But obviously, the story of COVID is still unfolding. Huh? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. We haven't seen the full impact. We, as key populations and communities, we're still even trying to observe what is actually happening with our communities. Everyone keeps on saying, oh, the needs are still the same. Probably not, but we'll see. With COVID-19, probably things change a little bit for us as key populations and communities. We don't know, it's still unfolding. But from your experience and from in global advocacy and conversation around health financing, health and development financing, what should we pay attention here, Jeff, especially around financing of key population? What does it mean that we need to address COVID, but also address HIV at the same time? Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Rico, for the question. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who are tuning in. So Peter Sands really raised 4 important points in securing investments towards key population-led responses. And since the lockdowns began as early as December of last year, we saw how the Global Fund has immediately responded through the COVID-19 response mechanism, the grant flexibilities, and the ACT accelerator. And I do appreciate these actions, but at the same time, I think we are missing the core of what needs to be addressed. Addressing the disruption in accessing HIV prevention and treatment amid the COVID-19 pandemic require immediate response, obviously. But COVID-19 has amplified structural challenges that continue to hamper key populations from accessing life-saving services. In our region, Asia and the Pacific, we see from South Korea to Indonesia, even to the Philippines, key populations are being targeted as scapegoat or are being persecuted, and our safety and livelihood are being threatened. Yet we see governments using the same principles of criminalizing people living with and are assumed to have HIV to criminalize those who have or have survived COVID-19. What's worse is governments are making drastic steps to silence the activism, when in fact this is the same activism that shaped the HIV response that we have today. And this is what we should be paying attention. If funding partners such as the Global Fund has quickly diverted its funding towards COVID-19, we also need to see quick responses in doubling available investments towards addressing social and economic, gender-related barriers and human rights-related barriers, including addressing stigma and discrimination that COVID-19 has magnified. And we also need to see investments that would help sustain key population organizations that have been severely affected by COVID-19. But unfortunately, these are not considered priorities. For example, Rico, why should not we be surprised? For example, why is it easier to approve requests to reallocate funding to buy personal protective equipment than food support for transgender sex workers who lost their sources of income when both need to be equally prioritized? Hence, in a report that we will be releasing together with the Global Fund Advocates Network Asia Pacific this Friday, we are calling for the Global Fund and funding partners to provide specific allocations to civil society and support civil society and key population-led responses to augment not only the immediate, but also the long-term community and key population-led COVID-19 responses. And this is not only to cover PPEs, but also to sustain the advocacy activism at the country level. Maybe let me end my point here by reminding us all that in the 2019 UHC high-level meeting, governments emphasized the need to reach the furthest behind first. And in this COVID-19 crisis, we must not allow those who are furthest behind to be silenced, neglected, and even erased. And that requires immediate attention, increased investments, and braver and bolder political commitments. I think I'll stop here first. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. And once again, I mean, our community speakers questioning, like Phelister also mentioned about what does it mean reaching furthest behind, and what does it mean leaving no one behind? And put it in your chat as well, people. Like, how do you think the world can actually realize that commitment? Because that commitment has been set for like 30 years, 40 years already. So, you know, what does it mean actually? And thanks for that, Jeff. And let's go to the next speaker here, Olga. And Olga, hi, unmute your unmute your computer. And so I'm going to ask you about Minister Kaag's video because she passionately talked about the Dutch government commitment towards key population and their central role in HIV response. Even in developed country, it is sometimes difficult to actually see commitment like that. Minister who are actually really committed to the issue, to the key population, and basically saying things as it is. She said that she's against the conservatism and the right-wing politics, basically. Oh, sorry. Sorry, the question got turned. Hold on. Let me. Right. So I missed that question. I'm sorry, people. Difficult to read here. Sorry, your question is about Dr. Torre Rosas' intervention, yeah? And she spoke about community work as part of a strengthening health system. Like obviously in many countries, communities are not considered as part of a health system. It's sort of an extra to the health system itself, and it's a temporary extra only to address HIV response. So it's considered not as part of the community, health system itself. From your point of view, how does it look like to have community as part of a health system, as part of a, not only as part of a health system, as part of a strengthening health system? So there's an added value there. And how it would ideally look like when communities are becoming essential part of the health system. Go ahead.
Thank you. Eurasian Network People who Use Drugs. Nobody left behind for us on the practical level. It means friendly way and professional assist. The Global Fund has allocated 28 million to strengthening the healthcare system, but in our countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, its strengthening means more repression. Belarus today, OST participant die of coronavirus, suffering from withdrawal symptoms. In Kazakhstan, programs have been implemented more than 10 years ago, and till now we are asking Global Fund, UN agency to deliver methadone to the hospital. The basic needs doesn't exist. 50 years ago, the Global Fund have brought in our region the pills, ART and OST medicine, and this medicine saved our lives. Today, OST medicine is purchased at the lowest cost, lowest price from national farm company without quality control. It's convenient for everyone except of us. National NGO reported the successful expansion of OST. The Ministry of Health invests Global Fund resource to local pharma business. But this medicine not normalize our body conditions. We have to look some additional substances. You know, this is the next of the injection, HIV, Hep C, abscess. This costs too much for our health and our resource. In Ukraine, not only Ukraine, in Ukraine last month, our sister committed suicide because of her daughter, her children were took away from her in maternity hospitals. It happened, always it happened in our country, still again, 20 years, for 20 years, and Global Fund, UN agency, a lot of guidelines, in ways to give resource for our services, but how you mentioned it, this is access the quality services, what we need. As a national level, we do our best to be meaningful involved in decision-making process. We are part of CCM body, key population platforms, a lot of other meetings. But still now we invest a lot of time and resource in order to explain the Global Fund stuff, the UN stuff, the NGO, national or PR about the principal recipients, why we need to invest resource to drug policy changing, building the shelters, to buying the pipes, filters, and capsules for harm reduction. Usually they answer us, no, it's not applied to HIV. But meta-analysis of 151 randomized researchers has been proven that 89% of these researchers found a direct connection between HIV reduce and decriminalization. As for our colleague from Netherlands said about their support, what we should do now and what we must do now, we must implement it, I do it principles and values in each our city. We have direct contact with mainline, Sanani, Medicines, DAC, with professional organization who know how to implement the program. We should invest resources to internships, that our community activists have opportunity to feel how to come to services without feeling of guilty, and thoughts how to escape from this as soon as possible. After that, we return home and we're sure that it's possible to create the comfortable services. And if we get direct resource with monitoring support from mainline, from Sananim, direct in our countries, we can create what we want to, what we need now. And it's a time to create, we think about the social enterprises, we need to have the basis, because 20 years I have been working in the NGO and Global Fund in another project. But as I came to this program without anything, it's still now, we don't have drop-in center, we have the offices of NGO, we don't have shelters, we have the hotels for create the meeting. We should change our approach and look at directly what kind of basic, if we have at each city, the drop-in center, shelters, and friendly, professional friendly services. We know how to do it. We have professional colleagues from other countries who now implemented this service. We should think together how to change approach of and how to fundraise investors who care about economical issues and about policy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Olga. And thanks a lot for raising the issue around criminalization as well. I am looking at the comments. Apparently this is so difficult. Okay, so we also have one of the participants, Shane Petzers. I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong. Also mentioned criminality of vulnerable and key population remains an ongoing issues. COVID-19 amplifies existing and ongoing concerns progressing, working in HIV and the related human development area. After this session, we're going to try to host a question and answer session. So please start submitting your questions now so that we can see that later when we enter that particular session. Before that, let's go into the two last speakers. Sergio, it's your turn now. I asked that question for Olga, apparently that's actually for you. And Olga looks yes. So surprised.
Me too.
So Sergio, Minister Kaag spoke passionately about the Dutch government commitment towards key population and their central role on HIV response. As I mentioned earlier, even in developed country, it is difficult to actually find high-level government officials that is actually committed and publicly declare their commitment like what Minister Kaag did. what do you think can be done by UN agencies or Global Fund or National AIDS Program or other actors in HIV response to mobilize real political commitment towards key population? Because the commitment that we have seen so far is just signing documents or blah, 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 mostly, right? But soon after the donor left, after the UN left, then everything is just business as usual. So how do you think we can mobilize these real commitments and sustainable commitments in a way? Go ahead, Sergio.
Yes, great, thank you. I'm gonna be speaking in Spanish, considering we have translation.
Thank you very much for this question. Also, I would like to thank for this space given. Definitely, this is a unique event that will be marking an important step for all our communities. So with regards of the question that you posted and considering also the comments that we received during this plenary session and the video given to us, I would like to be straightforward on what do we think as the communities, what is missing for us in order to show a real political commitment that goes beyond signing documents or signing all these commitment agreements from the United Nations. That in paper may seem to be a very important advance, but in the political practice, it is not translated. On one hand, I want to consider the question that what do we expect from the United Nations? What do we expect from these institutions that should be responding to our needs of our communities? So being straightforward in that sense on the fact of what is missing, well, what is missing is money. We need funds. We need to have access to specific funds for the communities. In all the cases where we had faced as humanity several pandemias or several crisis situations because of health issues or because of pandemias such as HIV or COVID, as well as in some other cases where we need to, Sergio, one apology here because we need to give instructions on the interpretation. They need to choose Spanish so they can hear to the English. You can continue now, Sergio. So we consider that based on these institutions in the United Nations, we have had more than 70 years. We have had these ratifications and these letters and documents, and we have these events that speak about inequalities, but they had not translated beyond those symbolic events. In particular, with regards of the question and considering what do we need as institutions from the Global Fund, I am so grateful that we have people as Peter, that they give these open discourses as showing figures and giving us data, specific data about the needs that they are covering. But still, there's a lot of lacking. In our communities, we have plenty of examples and we have great capacities to do the job that is needed, to give response, to outreach these responses outside these infrastructures that in a sense, we believe it's a way of doing things in an old fashion or archaically. As an example, the mechanisms, the coordination mechanisms that are implemented in these countries, they're just not only but short spaces when they don't discuss these power communities. I mean, they diminish our identities, they diminish our political identities as well as our personal identities that we take to these spaces, and we are forced to imitate, we are forced to copy a power structure where we do not feel comfortable, we as LGBTI communities or those indigenous communities, because we discuss in different ways all these power structures. So specifically for these organizations or that we offer services, a great example was the case of Juliana that was previously mentioned, that all the bad benefits that they receive, and they are the ones who do all the job. They are the ones who do this hard work at the social level. They are the ones who keep the people healthy, and they are the ones who keep this liaison within these healthcare systems. And they are the ones who need more of these services. And then it is not given that way. So also the organizations that provide the services, we have the experience, we are the experts, we have the well-equipped communities and organizations in order to offer the services to these communities. And in this sense, we need to hold this conference online, and I think that this will remark those needs specifically. On the other hand, I would like to mention that what are the things that can be done from the institutions such as the Global Fund or the United Nations, or even the HIV national health programs in the countries. They can bet and they can include more horizontal learning techniques. And in that sense, I can say that we are so proud from our communities because we have great advances, more of what we expected due to the barriers that we tackle. So we don't want to have to follow these learning horizontal structures, or we don't want to follow these hierarchical structures. We have great technical capacity in order to teach among peers and to learn among our peers and our communities just to make this happen. So such as the networks, the coordination work that we have with MPact, AMPOC, Gay Latino, ECOM, and with M Coalition, just to mention a few networks where we are having a great job, and then we can offer these responses. We are well equipped to do so. And finally, in those countries that they had shown certain advances, and I'm just taking and repeating the words from Minister Kaag, on the sense that we need to force those countries that already have these advances so they can move forward and they can be expanded to other countries. So we can keep them also, we can defend, or we can send them to other countries where we need that support, because there's a great number of countries where Black women, Black trans women, indigenous women, gay men, or individuals that are non-binary are the ones that are the most affected as for any health public crisis or any political crisis or any crisis as for humanitarian problems. So we are the most affected, and we are still the most affected. So we also need to add the fact that we have the experience, we have the resiliency in order to move forward and to tackle all these battles. And finally, I would like to end taking the words of George Ayala, that what he mentioned at the beginning. I admire the work that is done, and definitely I think that this is a very important concept test in order to participate. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Sergio. I think like we live in a world where, all of us here, we came from key population, we came from different kind of work background. And I think, what binds us is that we were also working on HIV as well. And, when we work on HIV, there's a lot of people who will convince us that, HIV is only about health, or HIV is only about this or about that. But no, let's reject that notion. It is a very political movement, and we have made our choice as well, right? So we'll have to follow that up too. And thanks a lot for your interventions around that. I apologize for the translation problem there, the confusion. We'll try to discuss with the organizer how we can actually disseminate Sergio's intervention in English and in other languages as well, so that other people can also enjoy that excellent intervention. Let's move forward to the last speaker before we actually go into question and answer. It's Mahri, and it's actually a question around something that has been discussed in this panel, but also in the chat as well. It's about that thing that people always say, leaving no one behind. That slogan has been used since 70s, basically. Imagine how many members of our population, of key population, that people are dead, literally waiting for someone to actually help them and someone to actually pick them from being behind, but they were left behind. And it's interesting because, that term, leaving no one behind, is actually a military term. And in military term, it's actually referring to dead bodies. So you're not leaving soldiers behind in the war. You have to carry their dead bodies. It's quite ironic that we keep on using that word as actually, but you know, now it's 2020. Yeah? I mean, and the progression of technologies are quite amazing. It's the first time that we feel that we're connected as a world, probably. I'm in Amsterdam, and I can wink my eyes, and someone in Lisbon will immediately notice that, and immediately say that, immediately see that, basically. In Zambia and Zimbabwe and in others as well. So things are easier here because we're connected. But so basically the means are already there, maybe. But from your perspective, what would you describe as the real challenges to address inequities, and particularly health inequities? Go ahead, Mahri.
Okay. Hi, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to the HIV 2020 organizers for inviting me to be on the panel. Trans women face a disproportionate burden of HIV, yet our voices are too often absent in global policy spaces. And for our trans brothers, we're often told there isn't enough data to even merit a mention in these discussions. In response to the videos we have just seen, I would like to say that the trans community is still waiting to see that progress in the HIV epidemic that was mentioned earlier. We still have problems accessing care, and when we find care, it often doesn't affirm who we are or fully support our ability to manage HIV or decrease our risk of getting HIV. So many of us are still fighting for basic survival and the legal recognition of our names and gender marker changes, which prevents us from finding employment, accessing housing, and keeps us a step behind our cisgender siblings. These structural barriers affect our trans-led organizations as well. Our community, individually and collectively, needs more than statements of concern and solidarity to fix the problems we are facing. Our trans-led organizations need financial commitments to back up these statements. We, trans people, know how to reach and support our trans siblings who are the most vulnerable, and we are the subject matter experts on the realities we are facing. Our solutions may not look like the solutions that funders expect, but nevertheless, they are going to have to put their trust in us if they really want solutions that work for our community. Trans-led organizations in the global HIV response are vastly underfunded. A 2014 report by American Jewish World Service and Global Action for Trans Equality noted that more than 50% of trans groups operated on less than $10,000 per year, and that only 2% of these groups focus on work at a global level. When many of our trans-led organizations approach funders, we are either given minimal support, or we're told we're not ready yet, or sometimes we're told to form consortia, but then when we form those consortia and apply, we're often told that we don't have the capacity to implement the programming. These practices preserve the status quo and leave trans-led organizations struggling. Building equity requires extra work on the part of those who have the resources, not the communities who are struggling. It is time that our allies and donors do the extra steps that it takes to put our community on equal footing instead of placing that burden on us. We have heard this morning about the importance of social capital, and as we know, the trans community has tons of it. We have supported our cisgender siblings in the fight for many intersectional issues affecting us all. Increased visibility for our community has often increased our vulnerability to violence, stigma, and discrimination, yet we have pushed forward to stand up and be counted. What progress we have made has been on shoestring budgets and far more often for free. We cannot build a new generation of trans leaders with the status quo. We need radical acknowledgement and action from our allies and funders that addresses the deep historical barriers that we are facing. As our community faces the new pandemic of COVID-19, we wonder, how will we survive with what we've already learned living through the concurrent epidemics of HIV and transphobic violence? COVID-19 is exposing structural inequality in the most unexpected places, but for the trans community, these problems are not new and have lingered for far too long without a solution. In order for trans communities to solve the problems we are facing, we need investments of financial capital, plain and simple. We cannot survive on social capital alone. We need an infrastructure of healthy, adequately resourced trans-led organizations around the world who can work together and share knowledge with each other. Our organizations need funding to hire and, most importantly, to pay trans people to deliver HIV prevention, treatment, and care solutions that are tailored for our community. Empowered trans organizations can work to achieve the goal of ending AIDS by 2030, but not under the current status quo. We need funders to trust us and take chances on us. We said it in Durban during the first ever Trans Pre-Conference at AIDS 2016, no more lip service. Trans access, equity, and rights now. It is even more true today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Mahri. And audience, if you're at home, we cannot hear you clap, but we can assume that you're clapping for the five great community panelists as well. And I think I'm sorry, that's my house bell. It's supposed to be pizza man. Sorry for that. Yeah, I can continue now. Sorry, I ordered pizza because I'm hungry, and if you need to know, it's a big pizza. So let's try to get some questions. Maybe we still have time, like around that bell again. Hold on. Around 10 minutes. Yeah, or maybe around 5 to 6 minutes if we have any questions in the chat. And because of the amount of questions, we will have to prioritize. Apologies, everyone. Oh, everyone is clapping on the chat now. Thank you for that. I can see. I definitely agree with Rico. I agree with you too. Let's see. Let's see. Apologies that I have to go through this. And other organizers, if you have any, you identify any questions from the Facebook streams, please feel free to send it to me and to my channel so I can see. It's a bit pain scrolling this chat because obviously we're quite active. Oh, let me check my phone then. Yeah, there was a question that was directed to a particular. Oh, the question is on the Q&A. There's one question here. I'll just read out the question first, and I have to read it out slowly. And you know, any of the community activists can, community panelists can answer. Right. Many developing countries like Nepal, you know, there's a problem related to the sexually transmitted disease, but people cannot talk about it openly and cannot share a problem related to that. So it's considered as taboo. Oh, additional question. What and how can we do for how to improve that situation, basically? I'll read a couple of questions and then we'll try to get I'm going to read a question that is actually it's a statement, but if you want to respond, the panelists, please feel free. In accordance to the statement of Dr. Alethse, how can we ensure the participation of all organizations in terms of budget for HIV prevention actions in the context of COVID-19 and in the spaces of participation that allow planning and adaptation of strategies in this context? You know, COVID-19 during crisis, there's always something that is lacking is usually the participation of all actors, because people sort of panic and they want to address the issue immediately. But what do you think we can do to increase that participation? Another question is from Omar, which is, as long as we are criminalized, we will be left behind. How are we going to rally together to make sure donor invests to address criminalization of KP groups? I'll stop there and see if any of the panelists wants to respond to any of the questions. Jeff, you unmuted. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure, Rico. I think I'd like to respond on the question regarding Nepal and also Omar's question. With Nepal, especially during the COVID-19, there has been a lot of innovations that young people, especially young key populations, have devised in order to reach out to their peers despite the lack of and the need to physically distance from each other because of COVID-19. But I think what needs to happen here is that in funding these different innovations, we should not stop at funding only funding them as operational researches. And then eventually, when this gets into national funding requests, this gets operated by bigger NGOs, which are not key populations led. So we really need to fight that kind of transition and shift of these innovations, and these should be key populations led. Peter Sands earlier was saying there is creativity that happens in a moment of necessity. But if we allow these different innovations to be taken away from key populations who are in need and who are familiar with their communities, then we're losing the point of rolling out these different innovations that actually caters to key populations. On the question of Omar, I mean, coming from the Philippines, it's very important to really, for funding partners such as the Global Fund, to really use their position to demand accountability, especially in the Philippines when governments are starting to silence activism and equating activism with terrorism. What we do is not terrorism. What we do as activists is demand accountability. And the government cannot hide their incompetence if they cannot respond accordingly, either in HIV or COVID-19. Even in tuberculosis, for example, here in the country. And we need to fight together along with other, not only key populations, but broader sectors, development sectors who are also equitably affected by this pandemic. And we need to work with them together. We need to consolidate our voices even more, because the move of the different governments all around the world, and including Asia and the Pacific, is very, very fast in trying to silence activists like us. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that, Jeff. And I'm going to offer other panelists to answer the other questions as well that has been posed. And I just want to note that, Mahri, there's a question specifically to you from Kate Harrison. If you can take a look at that, and then I'll let the panelists now choose whether or not they want to respond. Yeah, in the Q&A. So it's a question about what are the examples, because you mentioned about activities that funders will be surprised about. If you can give examples on some of them, basically. But let me go to the other panelists and see if they want to answer any of the question that I posed earlier, or response to Jeff. Response to Jeff's. Okay, Maria, let's go to you.
Yeah, not a lot is coming to me this early in the morning, but I do know that some of our partners want to do things that maybe seem not so directly connected to HIV risk, especially when people are thinking more on a biomedical framework. But as I mentioned, I mean, so many in our community can't even really find employment or find basic social support and housing and stuff like that. So some of the organizations that we work with want to do things just as simple as giving job training, and it's not necessarily training somebody to be an outreach worker, but maybe they want to train them to do whatever is appropriate there where they're living. But they're not getting funding for these things, but we know that that's a structural barrier that increases someone's risk to HIV. So, employing trans people and recognizing us legally, so we were working to do those kinds of things would really make a big difference, but that's not the kind of stuff that a funder really wants to support.
Thanks a lot for that, Mahri, and I hope, Kate, it answered you. And I see that chat that it seems like she did answer your question, Kate. And before we close, I'm going to offer the panelists a chance for their last statement. Well, not last statement, last statement for this session. You're not going to be dead anytime soon, I hope. In my list, there's Jeff, Mahri, Sergio, Phelister, and then Olga. So you can think about what do you want to say to the audience, and do note that we have diverse audience, and this is being broadcasted in Facebook as well. I've received quite a lot of messages, and some of those messages are asking for the phone numbers of the panelists. So I guess we can figure out other use for this webinar. But Jeff, go ahead, Jeff, and tell us your last statement for this session.
Thank you so much, Rico. No, just to correct you, this is not your regular webinar. This is our way of reclaiming the response. So I'm very excited to be part of this opening plenary. Maybe I would just want to reiterate that COVID-19 entered the global picture at a critical juncture of the AIDS response. And since the COVID-19 pandemic began, we have been hearing this new buzzword, we need to learn from the HIV response. A lot of speakers have said that, in other conferences and in other meetings and engagements. But what we need to understand is that what made the HIV response very unique is because the systems to respond to HIV are not in place right now because of random improvements. These are outcomes of the anger, the relentless voices, the power of agency that has driven our key populations and people living with HIV like me to demand accountability. And we need to sustain this. We need to fund activism if we want to end both HIV and COVID-19 pandemics. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Jeff. And Mahri, go ahead, Mahri.
Oh, I didn't have anything to say. I'm confused. Right. I'm a little lost.
Okay, don't worry. We can come back later. We're asking you to provide last statement. Is there anything else that you want to say to the audience? It's okay. We'll come back to you in the end.
I was looking at the chat.
Sergio first. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of activities in the chat.
No, it's too early. Sergio. It's too early. No.
Exactly.
No worries.
Go ahead, Sergio.
Yes, I'm going to be speaking in English right now for sake of time. And thank you so much again for all this feedback. I think it's so important and refreshing. One thing that I got from the question that Omar posted there regarding funding, something that also triggers me not only in good ways, but also in very bad and anxious ways. Because often we hear that we have enough experience, we are the leaders, we are the this and that and blah, blah, blah. But we are never being paid enough to do that work. And I think that what Mahri mentioned also is very critical, because we in Latin America are also proposing what seems radical in terms of asking for for businesses and institutions to hire more trans people, to hire people from the community, to stop gatekeeping access to funding, to stop the gatekeepers of these connections and everything, because we have the ability to do what's needed in new ways and just with the funding. I take on what Peter mentioned during his video, that the Global Fund is moving swiftly to support countries, but I would say that this, even though they are supporting countries, they are not supporting communities directly. And I think that we need to decolonize these structures again. We need to discuss about the power structures, and we need to discuss about what kind of ideas they have in mind for reparations and, you know, to repair what's been done in the past, and to include the data and the strong data that supports our ability to do things. The numbers of people on retention, on ART, are not from the solely public sponsored places or solely public responses, are the ones led by the community that are proven the most better results. And yeah, I would only close by saying that we should never compromise our political ability to demand what's our right. And in this case, it's only for them to pay for what we need to do. The Global Fund should not lead the response, should not lead the way to do things, but they should pay for us to do that work. And yeah, thank you, gracias.
That is an awesome last statement, Sergio. And you're right. I mean, maybe the Global Fund shouldn't focus on countries, but maybe they should focus on communities and instead. I'm inserting my own agenda there, but yeah. Mahri, I want to check if you're ready. Go ahead, Mahri.
I'm ready. Yeah, I just want to come back. I like that the speakers did acknowledge some of the assets that we have in our community responses, such as the social capital and the progress that, of course, has been made for some people. But I do think, again, especially for the trans community, when we talk about building equity, we just really have to acknowledge that extra steps might be needed for our community, because so many of our community are facing that additional barrier of not even being able to fully participate in society. As someone mentioned in the chat that is in relation to COVID, that, you know, trans people have been living socially distanced lives for quite some time. You know, so that's not a new reality to us, but we need to come out of this epidemic and the epidemic, but all the epidemics we're facing with, you know, more support for us to come out of the margins. I think if people really want solutions, we just need people to make those extra steps towards our community and allow us to lead that way. And that's it for me.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mahri. And Olga, to you, Olga.
Yes, thank you so much, and happy to be here. And global community should support all our local activities till we get the result we need. I hope that during the conference HIV 2020 we get our result. We think together how do we solve this issue to bring methadone to Belarus and Kazakhstan hospital. If we do it together and you help us to think how to do it, this is a small result, give us the most opportunity to stay healthy and happy, and we're very happy to be together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Olga. And Phelister, your name has been repeated in the social media nowadays. Go ahead, Phelister, and give us your wisdom, your last wisdom for this session. No, I think she's having a network problem.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I think one of the things that I want to say is like also responding to one of the questions that Omar had. And for as long as criminalization still exists in our countries, key population will always lack in many spaces. And today I would like to urge the partners and the donors, Global Fund, support the criminalization of key population, because while we are criminalized, we always move 10 steps ahead. Then when they talk about criminalization, that brings back 10 steps back. It's high time we start supporting community interventions on decriminalization, because community are suffering and are fearing no matter how they look. It is very complicated to operate within a criminalized space. Another thing is give funding opportunities to community organizations. Community have proven themselves that they can do better. We have seen them with the small support they get from the local funders they have within the countries, and they have done marvelous jobs with it. It's high time we press hard as the Global Fund to make sure that communities are also getting supported within the Global Fund funding that is coming in country. Last but not least, one of the things I want to make it very clear to people is the fact that we need to look at key populations as human beings. Because most of the time, when partners are, when the INGOs who are receiving the funding are coming to respond to our needs, they come to us like as if we are not human beings. It's high time the funders and the partners see the human face that we have as human beings so that they can be able to work together with us. I want to finish this by saying today, 24 sex workers were arrested. They've been in jail for 5 days. And what an implementing partner in that county who is receiving even Global Fund money that has human rights grant to respond to that need. The only thing that you partner took is a condom. How can you take condoms to prison to people? You didn't even take food. You did not even consider their ARVs. I think we need to start responding and we need to start implementing in a human way. And by doing this is having communities taking a lead so that they can be able to show the people how it is done and how they want to be treated. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Phelister. And again, hand clap for all the panelists as well. And before we leave, just a few words for me. I do think that this is a very different conference. I mean, this is a very different webinar, just like what you said. I'm hoping that through this HIV 2020 online, we can relight the fire of activism. I came from generation of activists where anger and survival is basically driving our activism. Sometimes I feel that we're no longer angry, but we have to. And if you can't be angry, let me tell you one fact. The other areas of HIV prevention, treatment, and support, the challenges there happens, because of technicalities, because of difficult developing the technologies, and et cetera, et cetera. But for key population, the challenge is only one. We already know that communities can add into good intervention, and we already have all the means. But the challenge is only one. It's political commitment. And what does that mean? They just basically don't want us to survive. So be angry, only for that fact. Be angry. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sorry, guys. Before everyone leaves and signs off, I have just a couple of acknowledgements to make. First, I need to acknowledge the sad passing of Renata Koch and all those fierce advocates who are no longer with us and who struggled alongside us. So we're really saddened to hear about Renata's passing. I need to give you a look ahead in the conference program. Next slide, please. The program, just for your information, runs through October. As you see, we're doing our conference in 5 languages with simultaneous interpretation across all sessions. Our goals here are to provide safe space and to bring the focus back onto communities. The structure of HIV 2020 is organized around the themes of affinity, intersectionality, and solidarity. And we have several themes that are of importance to us. First is the unfinished business in HIV, and in particular, HIV incidence in key populations, which we're just learning is now 62% of all new infections in 2019. We're also, we'll see themes focused on criminalization, stigma, discrimination, and violence, community-led HIV services and community-led key population-led programs, funding, linking HIV with broader health, social justice, and human rights movements, intersectionality, and diversity within our communities. Next slide, please. You'll see sessions on our website, hiv2020.org. We're also pretty active across several social media platforms, so please look for us there. What's unique about our program is it focuses on issues that you will not see in mainstream programs. Social determinants of health. We'll see Beyond Blame challenging criminalization for HIV justice worldwide. our gay bodies. These are all examples of things you'll likely not see ever in a mainstream conference. Next slide. You see similar things in August. Next slide, please. And in September. Next slide. And right through to October, where we'll close our HIV 2020 conference. Next slide. You'll also see ongoing performances and exhibitions throughout our conference, because we acknowledge artists and performers as important contributors to the global HIV response. Next slide. I want to thank our conference coordinators, the fabulous Rachel Ang and Niluka Pereira. Next slide, please. I want to thank our co-organizers, GMP Plus, INPUD, NSWP, International Civil Society Support, and MPact Global Action for Gay Men's Health and Rights. Next slide. And the members of the HIV 2020 working groups, without whom we could not make this possible. And it really does take a global village to move a program like this forward. Next slide, please. Thank you to our interpretation team. Thank you very much. You did a wonderful job. Our plenary speakers today, all of you were so wonderful. Thank you for stepping in and speaking truth to power. Next slide. And thank you, co-sponsors. Our sponsorship levels are named for gathering spaces. Next slide. At the Plaza level, Gilead. Next slide. At the Agora level, Bridging the Gaps and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Thank you, Open Society Foundation and UNAIDS at the center level. And at the circle level, Vive Healthcare. Thank you very much. Next slide. And a very special shout out to HIV 2020 logo designer, John Gabriel Ortiz. He's the digital marketing director at Atlanta-based Thrive SS, a community-led organization dedicated to health equity for Black gay men living with HIV in the USA. Next slide. Most importantly, I want to thank you, the participants, registrants. You really, your participation and support means the world to us. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing you and seeing you in the programs in the weeks and months ahead. And with that, I bid you goodbye.